Today's webcast is a rebroadcast of an AIHA webinar that was recorded on February 10th. Both presenters have joined us live today, and they will answer your questions via chat during this broadcast. They will also participate in a live Q&A at the end of the presentation. And now, I will begin the rebroadcast.
Thanks, Rick. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Tips to Ensure Compliance with OSHA's Alignment with GHS Chemical Classification and Labeling. I'm Ed Rakowski, Editor-in-Chief of The Synergist, the magazine of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. I'd like to thank all listeners for attending today's event, and especially to Biovia for sponsoring this webinar. Dassault Systems Biovia provides a scientific, collaborative environment for advanced biological, chemical, and materials experiences. Biovia's CISPRO Chemical Inventory Management System enables organizations to manage chemicals safely from receipt to disposal along the entire lab-to-plant value chain, ensuring environmental health and safety compliance across the enterprise. Our presenter today is Ann Sefried. Ann is a pre-sales field applications engineer for Biovia who uses her application expertise to help organizations optimize their chemical inventory management activities. Ann graduated from Chapman University with a BS in Computer Information Systems. Also on today's panel is Denese Steeves. Denese is co-founder and senior consultant at Industrial Health and Safety Consultants in Shelton, Connecticut. She is a certified industrial hygienist and has previously served on the board of directors of the Society for Chemical Hazard Communication. Denese will not be presenting today, but is on the panel to help answer specific technical questions about GHS and OSHA's hazard communication standard. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Ann.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Let me go ahead and advance these slides here. Just a high-level overview of what we'll be covering, a quick introduction to the GHS, as well as a little bit about the OSHA standard and how that applies here in terms of chemical inventory management. Of course, then we'll talk a little bit about the challenges people face with chemical labeling, chemical inventory management, also SDS management, because both of those things are directly affected when it comes to GHS and the changes that are being adopted. And then, of course, sharing some tips to ensure compliance, how we've been able to assist customers in overcoming the hurdle of adopting the changes that are coming down with GHS. So one of the first things, and trying to keep this very basic and understanding, we really appreciate having Denese on the line. My background is not with GHS, but it is just providing a basic understanding, what is GHS, and really it's an acronym for the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals. Very basic, but the point is, the UN went out and they really looked at the way that people are classifying materials, not just in one region or one location, but around the world, and they determined that there's a lot of differences that they really wanted to overcome, and in doing so, they wanted to come up with a system for doing that. So they came up with GHS, and which, of course, leads to a logical question of, what is that? Really, it comes down to a logical and comprehensive approach to three primary things. Defining health, physical, and environmental hazards. So really looking at chemicals, and if you were to take a step back and think about life on a day-to-day basis, chemicals really are in every part of day-to-day life, not just in workplaces, but everywhere. And so being able to look at those materials and define, are they flammable? Are they toxic? Can they cause cancer if they're leaked into a river or stream? So a comprehensive approach to defining what those hazards are. And then even more importantly, being able to create classifications based on existing data. And what this really means is looking at not just how we here classify materials, but how they're classified around the world and coming up with a criteria so that we all classify them the same. Just an example, if I was talking about butane, it's a highly flammable material. We know that. Here in the U.S., we use the Hazardous Materials Identification System, also known as HMIS, which really looks at a couple key characteristics, things like flash point and vapor pressures. But the goal is that's a U.S.-based classification system so that when we look at butane, we know it's highly flammable. Flammable rating of 4, for example, versus a 0, which represents something that wouldn't burn. So that's the way we do it, but it's done differently around the world. Everybody has their own different types of classifications. So with GHS, the goal is to come up with common criteria to help define those hazards. And of course, the last thing, which is very important, is after we define the hazards based on common criteria, a way to communicate it effectively. Whether it's through labeling, whether we're shipping materials, we're storing them, we're disposing them, as well as creating SDSs, so safety data sheets that have all the information that a person needs to ensure that they're handling that chemical safely, they're storing it correctly, they're using it correctly. Leads you just to basic questions about why. Why are we doing this? And I found this little simple image here, which kind of, I think, in a big picture kind of explains it. If we were to look at hazards and the way that they're classified today, there's a lot of different imagery, there's a lot of different classifications, and if you look at the world trade today, there's a huge amount of chemicals that are changing hands and crossing lines, and there's no common way to understand if a flammable rating of 4 in an NFPA diamond is equivalent to a square box with a flame in it. There's a lot of difference out there, so there's this huge disconnect in how we classify those materials. So basically, if you were to look through a lot of the different information that's in the GHS, there's this one part that really jumped out at me in just simplifying it, and it's really this middle paragraph here. Through variations in definitions of hazards, a chemical may be considered flammable in one country but not in another. Or it may be considered to cause cancer in one country but not another. So the goal is, if you look at the big picture, as we continue to grow, trade becomes easier, communication, we need to make sure it's all streamlined. We want to make sure that if I order something from across the ocean and it comes in, I can look at it and know exactly what the hazards are, and not what the hazards are, how someone else based it, but based on the same criteria. And it's just very important to have everybody on the same page and then be able to easily translate it and communicate that information regardless of where you're located or where that material is being manufactured. Some key points just regarding, understand that the reason we're doing this is because the adverse effects of chemicals on people and the environment around the world. Just kind of, if you're to chop it down, many countries and organizations have lots of different laws, regulations regarding how we classify, how we communicate that information. And there's a significant gap. So between the way that everybody does that, how they classify it, how they communicate, there's a big enough difference that makes it difficult to share information, to pass chemicals and be able to use them. And some countries, when you think about how difficult this is, and there's a lot of things that go into classifying materials when you think about how many unique products there are out in the world, as well as new things being produced all the time, a lot of countries don't even have a system in place because it's just too overwhelming. So given all of that and the extensive level of global trade today, there's a basic need that GHS is going to try to overcome. The goal is to have that program in place to classify the materials correctly. That way we can ensure safe use, transportation, disposal, but in a way that is understood internationally. So I just grabbed a quick screenshot out of there, just really kind of highlighting the same things. The goal, if GHS is successful, is to really enhance protection of human health and the environment by providing that comprehensive system that I've been talking about. It's also providing a framework. So for countries that don't have the ability to have these large organizations that go out there and have, build these criteria, we can provide it. Here's the criteria. If a material has this flammability rating or this flash point or it's caustic, there's ways that you can easily identify that without having your own system in place, which of course reduces the need. So if I have the same material and you have it, we already know what the criteria is, we know how to classify it, it's going to reduce the need for testing and evaluation of materials because it's already been done. We can share that common information, which of course helps facilitate international trade of chemicals because everything's already been identified and we can easily understand what those classifications are. That really leads us into the second point, which is how OSHA is going to change and how that change affects us. So there's two primary things. There's a lot of different pieces of information, a lot of little things that's mixed in, but if you were to look at the two biggest things, OSHA is or has modified the HAZCOM standard in 2012 to help align with the UN's GHS. The goal, as already mentioned, is to have a comprehensive and standardized approach to the classification of the hazards and how to convey that information with a primary goal here in the U.S. of having the safest working environment possible. So there's two key things we're talking about: the standardization of label elements by hazard class and category, as well as the standardized order of information in the safety data sheet. So in some of these things, it's not a lot of different information, but because we're changing the criteria, what determines things to be hazardous, there may be changes in a material that we know as a certain classification. We look at the new regulation, it might change. We might need to change our classifications. We might need to update our labels. We might need to rewrite some of the content in our SDSs. Really, it provides for two different things. As I mentioned early, it's the enhancement of both the employer and the workers' comprehension. Again, we have people out there, and there's lots of different classifications. There's all those different pictograms. There's different signals. There's different rating systems. So what we want to do is ensure that the employers and the workers that are being exposed to these materials know how to properly handle them. They're using things safely. Is it in a fume hood? Does it need to be closed at all times? How does this material need to be used? What does it need to stay away from? And of course, the second part is being able to enable workers and emergency response personnel quick and efficient access to the information. So, one of the difficulties there is if we have, everyone's looked at SDSs before, and they're in different formats, and some have some information and another one has different information. And if every time you open one, you've got to dig around and figure out, what the classification is, that could be a problem in an emergency. So updating classifications so that from a labeling perspective, it's easy to understand what the hazards are. And the same thing with an SDS. If I need to find out, what I need to do, it's easy to open up and know I need to go to section 6 because all of them are going to be formatted the same. Which of course leads to just the transition, from a name perspective, dropping the M from material safety data sheets, now going to be referring to them as safety data sheets. And then of course, probably the bigger and harder thing, which both of them are pretty difficult to transition to, will be the labeling. Really what this part has to do with is manufacturing, being able to reclassify the materials. We're going to use new pictograms. They're red, they're bright, they're easy to see. And then everyone will be responsible for having key elements, like the product identifier, what is it, a signal word, whether it's a warning or a danger, the hazard statements, the cautionary statements, as well as the identification and a reference to the safety data sheet for additional information. So what we're going to see from an end user's perspective is as we're receiving new materials, they should start having the new GHS appropriate labels on them. So that's a manufacturing requirement. Which leads us really into how does that affect the lab? How does it affect chemical inventory management and, of course, labeling? We recently had a large convention with our company, talking about not just chemical inventory, but electronic lab notebooks. We talked about LIMS. We talked about experimental knowledge base. We talked about all these different systems out there in the lab used to collect data. And what we found over time was this term dark data. There's things that we don't know. And the reason we don't know is because you don't have a single source for collecting that information. Different information is collected. If you and I are both doing chemical inventory in our lab, I'm using an Excel spreadsheet, you're using a manual log, I'm tracking 10 fields, you're tracking 3. There's different content, and there's no easy way to access it. We have different workflows. Everything's disconnected, and when you have disconnected information, there's no way to update the information. It's very time-consuming if you were to have to go out and try to combine that content into a single form. So it's very challenging when you don't actually have a system in place to manage that. So if I was to put it into a visual perspective, you know, even with an Excel spreadsheet, if I have an Excel spreadsheet and the person in the lab next to me has one, if we don't have a common format, I might be tracking the name and the CAS number and maybe a total quantity for all the acetone I have in my lab, whereas the guy next door might be tracking the name and a flammability rating and a formula and an amount for each container. So it's varied information. And then, you know, we still have it where we go into labs and, you know, the most effective way they teach to manage chemicals today is the old-fashioned handwritten log. The container comes in, I write the information in, it just takes me a few minutes, it's pretty efficient, you know, write it down. The problem is in emergency situations, how do we get access to that? How do we know what's actually there? You know, that's a very time-consuming method to try to go through and extract data. And I even threw in a screenshot here just of an older system for use to track information. But again, if I have a system here and on the same campus, maybe in a different building, someone's using Excel, again, they're disconnected. So it's what we refer to as dark data. There's no way to actually capture all of these things and combine them together. The second part of that and how it leads into GHS is really about having a system that's outdated, you know, whether it's the logs or the Excel files or even I just grabbed a screenshot of one of our legacy systems. Great system. We still have people using it today. But the problem is it's outdated. You know, there's no field for GHS content. So as we move forward, you know, part of the OSHA initiative is to train our users. Because it's okay if you don't relabel your inventory, but the new stuff coming in will have the new labels. So the responsibility is to make sure that all of the employees and the workers understand what the new classifications are. So from a challenges perspective, if I'm using a solution that doesn't allow me to track that new information, it's very hard to adopt it. It's very hard when you can't see it side by side. This is my NFPA values. This is my fire code classification. This is the new GHS. There's lack of support for changes. If you're using a legacy system, you got to look at the fact that, you know, do you have a development group behind it? Are they able to make those changes to allow you to move forward, to grow as OSHA adopts these changes? And, of course, that leads to problems with duplicate sources for updating. You know, if I have an Excel spreadsheet and you have a system, neither of our systems allows to track the GHS content, then we're actually going to try to put it in, but it's going to be manual. It's not going to be actually correct or right format, and we're both doing the work possibly for the same chemicals. And, of course, the very last bullet item there really comes down to printed color labels. I've worked with Biovia for the past 10 years, and up until this point, there's never been a need. In all of the chemical inventory systems we've sold and supported, people were able to print black and white heat transfer labels so they're chemically resistant. They can sit in the containers. They don't get ruined, but there wasn't a need to put color labels on. But with GHS and the way that OSHA is adopting it, you are required to have the red diamond. So in the situations where I'm dispensing to a secondary container or something happened, I want to relabel it, I need to be able to not only print a label with the hazards, but I need to be able to include that color. So that does represent a challenge in terms of chemical inventory management. You know, so to kind of sum up some of the chemical challenges, really looking at the big picture, all the stuff that exists today, as long as it's labeled, as long as those labels align with GHS, they don't have to be labeled. It's not an undertaking that you have to take. You can if you want to, but it's not a requirement. But you got to understand that the new inventory coming in, manufacturers are required to produce those labels. So you're going to have a difference between what's coming in and what's already there. So people need to understand the differences and be able to read and understand both types of classifications, which leads to training. And I just drew this diagram. I think I saw someone actually already posted a question regarding this, but when, you know, one of the big differences when we talk about, you know, color, it's very easy. Kind of all of us know that red is usually something bad. It tells us to stop when we're at a light. It tells us, you know, if we look at Department of Homeland Security, you know, they've got these different ratings. If we're at red, you know, there's an imminent threat, for example. And it's the same thing with HMIS and the new GHS. But what's different is that they actually changed it. So when you're looking at an HMIS or an NFPA label with red, if I'm looking at that 4, that means it's extremely hazardous, it's extremely flammable. But under GHS, it's completely the opposite. The red still means hazardous, but the one is what represents to what extent. So it can be very confusing to have both systems in place, and you're allowed to do that as long as you just make sure everybody has the appropriate training, they understand the differences and how they apply. This leads us into SDS management challenges, which can be just as difficult as the chemical inventory management. We've got our gentleman over here that's probably tasked with looking at the SDSs and figuring out how we're going to tackle this problem. So some of the unique challenges when we think about inventory management is the fact that we also need to track SDSs. When we talk about R&D specifically, we're usually talking about a high volume of unique materials. So instead of having, being like a garage and having 10 chemicals, I've got my oil and I've got some lubricant, I've got a couple different things, I've got 10 things, but lots of each of those. We're looking at research and development, having lots of different unique things. I'm going to try this. I order it, I receive it, I test it. It doesn't work, I put it on my shelf. I order something else. Someone else down the hall orders that same thing. So you have a lot of different unique materials, all which may require an SDS. And of course, as you have new things coming on site, if you don't have a system in place, it's very hard to put visibility. What are the new materials? When did they arrive? Do we have the safety data sheet for it? Who has it? How do we find it? And of course, one of the biggest problems and challenges that we run into with all of our customers is limited resource. It needs to be done. Someone needs to do it. But safety always falls towards the bottom of the list. Lab and EH&S, they're disconnected. EHS has to make sure we have all these regulations looked after so that we stay in compliance. We have to have the SDSs. But is EH&S responsible for it? Should it be someone in the lab, someone ordering the material? A lot of times corporate will come down and say, here's the system, use it. Or we want everyone to put things on SharePoint. Or when you get the material in, email it to Meredith. She's going to keep track of everything for us. In addition, there's all these changes. Regulations continue to change, and GHS is a good example. Manufacturers being required to rewrite them, put them into a new format, reclassify the materials if necessary. So there's a huge turnover. And, of course, there's a deadline coming, but, they're not required to have them until June. So if you're required to have them, it might be a while. So when you look at that shelf and you look at all those binders, it can be a very daunting task. If I have, just 1,000, it might be daunting, but if I have 50,000 or 100,000 or 1 million unique products, I need to have those unique SDSs as well. So, not having a way to effectively manage those causes a lot of problems. It can be a very difficult process. So if you're to cut it down as to, how to supply what I need to do, well, we need to ensure that there's a safety data sheet for each material that requires one on site. Ensure that the safety data sheet is specific to the product. I know over time there's been conversations. Sometimes I could just have an acetone SDS, and technically it should cover for any of the SDSs or any of the acetone we have, even if it's from J.T. Baker versus Fisher Scientific versus Sigma Aldrich. But technically, you should have the manufacturer-specific SDS for the product that you have on site. And the next big challenge is you need to ensure that they're current. So as we transition to GHS, we know for a fact right now there's going to be a huge turnover. So maybe you have a product that's been in inventory for 10 years, you haven't seen an update in the last 5. If they're still producing that material, you can expect that you should soon be receiving an updated document. And you need to ensure that, as it becomes available, you have a process in place to help ensure that you acquire it, you add it to your archives, however you're currently doing that. And then, of course, the biggest thing is ensuring that from a safety perspective, when we think about a safe workplace, is making sure that all of the end users, our employees, people have access to that safety data sheet in case they need it. So, again, I'm a visual person, so if I sum this down, if I'm thinking about it, I've got that guy with my head on the side of the shelf, and I've got all these binders, and I'm thinking about how we're transitioning, and I've got to manually open that binder and start going one by one. Open it up, look at the paper file, see what date it is, go online, search for it, see if there's a current one available. If so, download it, print it, or place it in a file. And hugely daunting task. People use SharePoint. We've got an electronic system. Everybody uses it. We just upload it to SharePoint. That's great. But the question always comes back in our mind is, how do you know if SharePoint has an SDS for every material you have in inventory if you don't have an inventory system, if those two things aren't connected? And of course, again, using just a screenshot from one of our old legacy SDS management systems, there's no GHS content in there. There's not going to be GHS content in there. So again, if you're trying to do the same thing and expect change, you're not going to have success. So really just, really shortly, you have, a two-manual process. You have a disconnected process, which again, it's very hard to understand what you have in inventory, or manage your SDSs if you don't know what you have in inventory. And yes, I mean, it's outdated and potentially, looking towards the future, it's never going to change. So at some point, we need to look at what we're doing. We need to look at what we've been doing and understand that maybe this is a great system for the last 20 years, but moving forward, we really need to look at a solution that allows us to meet these new requirements that will continue to grow and have resources behind it, so as more changes come, we can also adopt those. One of the things I think a lot of people don't realize is how much time and effort goes into management, which is why you have no resources for this. And I use the dollar sign here just because time is money. We all know that we're all worth something. As we sit in an office, as we're working for our employees, they're paying us. So time that I spent managing something, is money spent. So if I look at my little first guy up here, he represents a person in a lab using a material. Let's use butane, and he is responsible for keeping an SDS. So I've got my SDS binder, I've got my document in it. It took me time to do that. And over time, if I'm responsible for also reviewing and updating it, that's more time, that's more effort, that's more money. What compounds that is the fact that I might have my friend down the hall that also uses the same material. But the way corporate set this up is that we're responsible for managing our own. So now you have it stored in your binder, I have it stored in my binder. When it's time to update it, you spend time doing that, I spend time doing that, time and money times two. Bigger picture, we're dealing with a lot of organizations around the world that are looking at a comprehensive way to adopt GHS. So they can streamline it, they can clean up everything, make sure everything's just clear, crisp, and manage. You've got the guy that's actually in another building. It's not me and you next to each other. It's actually a guy in another building. Okay, that makes sense. We want him to have the SDS over there too. So he has a binder. He spends his time, money. Same document, same material. And then you've got the guy that's at another site. I'm in Northern California. We've got a site in New York. We both have the same material. So now technically I have one material from the same manufacturer. I have a different document. We're all spending time maintaining, updating, reviewing. So that's a lot of different money, a lot of time spent on the same thing. And as I was preparing for this presentation, thinking about, this specifically, because it's a big thing that we run into a lot of customers, is how do we get around that? I came across this little image, and it just kind of cracked me up after our worldwide kickoff. And I think it just sums it all up. I started a task force to eliminate redundancies in our internal processes, thinking about that last slide. Really, I'm doing the same thing. Like, okay, sometimes we're off the mark, and sometimes we have great intentions. We get a great system, but we don't look at the big picture. We don't look at, it's not just me and you, it's the guy in the next building. On a bigger scale, we work with a lot of customers that have not just one site. They might have 10 sites in the U.S. and then 5 overseas. Looking at the big picture. When you're going to, as you move forward, there's more and more technologies out there that don't limit you to manage stuff in single silos and having that dark data. There's ways to go out and accomplish everything and do it once so that you can be more effective. You can save people time, give them their time back so they can work on the bench, they can be productive, they can be safe, they can have access to a data sheet, and just more effective overall. So if I was to sum this all up, or some of the things that just to kind of take away from here, just to make clear, is that, not all inventory requires an SDS. So of course, it's important to understand that within the inventory, there's things that do require it. Those are the ones that you need to manage. Over time, I've been on site with a lot of customers, walked through a lot of different labs, and there's inventory that we've had that's completely safe, but it's been here since 1962. Maybe it's labeled, maybe it's not. Maybe we have a safe data sheet from back then, or, hey, maybe it was before we even had safe data sheets, so we don't have one. Well, If it's a discontinued product, you're not going to get a new one. So as GHS comes out, you don't have to write one, you don't have to try to acquire one, there's not going to be one. So understanding that not everything needs an SDS, some of the things will never have one, and that's okay. And not all manufacturers are ready for this. You know, there's people frantically out there trying to reclassify all the materials, trying to produce those new documents. But if you produce thousands of chemicals, this is a huge process, and people are spending a lot of money and a lot of time doing this. So find a way to keep track, find a way to understand which materials need them, identify which ones don't, understand which ones are never going to have an update, understand which manufacturers have not given you an updated document, which leads into how to do that. How do we do that successfully? How do we understand in a clear and concise way what materials do we have? Which ones require SDSs? How are they classified? What are the labels? What are the differentiations between the old classifications and the new? Is there anything we need to change? Which really, again, leads to tips and solutions to help ensure compliance. And what we've found over time to be most successful is to track inventory in real time. Kind of like the chicken before the egg and the egg before the chicken, which comes first? Well, if my requirement is to manage a safety data sheet, you need to know what the inventory is to know which SDSs you need to track. So if you track your inventory in real time, we know on a day-to-day basis what new comes on site, how much we have of all the things we have, where the stuff is located. You use a central data repository. So we think electronic, we think connected, we think easy to access. And when we talk about the dark data, we talk about siloed information, we talk about not having access and duplication of effort. Think about using a system that's easy to access. You define the information one time, and that way you can reuse it, whether I'm down the hall, across the street, or in another state, on the other side of the world. If you're only defining information once and putting a safety data sheet in there once that everybody can access, then you're really saving a lot of time and making people more efficient. And, of course, using an electronic system, you can also streamline activities because in all the years I've been doing this, you know, chemical inventory management is one of the least things people want to do. It's not my job. I'm a researcher. It's not my job to classify the materials or write down that we have it or dispose it when we're done. So we want to make sure that that's as streamlined as possible, easy to share information, and easy to access, because we all know if you give me a task and it's difficult to do and there's no management behind me saying you actually have to do this, I'm not going to do it. So make it easy to access, make it an efficient system, and make sure people can share and get to that information that they're looking for. In terms of the programs that we've produced, you know, our goal, what we found out a long time ago, is that barcoding and inventory management really go hand in hand. You know, because the goal is, if I want to have real-time inventory, if I want to be able to effectively understand what the hazards are and have the safety data sheet, you want to track at the individual container level so that we know what came in, when it expires, when we should dispose of it, you know, all those different details, and you want to track it from receipt to disposal. So a lot of people today, they get away with the thought that once it's here, I wrote it in my log, and then I forget about it. Or it came into shipping and receiving, we documented it, but once it goes to the lab, we have no idea. So again, I might be managing a safety data sheet for the next 15 years for stuff we don't even have in inventory. So there's a really big benefit of putting a barcode on it, tracking it, so that if it's still out there, we know we need to keep managing it. If it's not, we can then stop managing that document. Don't waste time on stuff you don't need to do. Another key thing is, you know, when you're doing this, define it once, identify the hazard, set up the material correctly, associate the safety data sheet, receive containers. So I put a couple examples of labels down here just to kind of understand it. There's a significant difference between inventory labels and hazard labels. So from an inventory standpoint, we want to know what we have. We want to track that from receipt to disposal. We can do that efficiently through barcoding, putting a barcode scan on it, scanning it in, moving it, disposing it when we're done. But also having a system that allows you to print GHS compliant secondary labels. But order material from Sigma Aldrich. It shows up at the dock. It's got the appropriate safety data, the pictograms, the signal words, the risk phrases. It's got the information on it. That's great. But once it gets into the lab, if I dispense from that primary container to a secondary container, and the intention for that container is that it will be here a while, might want to print a hazard label affixed to it. So I need to be able to print these type of labels. These are all examples just different styles of labels that are printed from the Biovia Sefried system. Labels, just I guess the last comment I'd make, we see that there's a lot of information manufacturers are required. It's a big requirement to track all this information, and inventory ranges in size. You might have really small containers, really large containers. You can put, CSDS for more information. There's some key things that you could put in there. We've supported everything down from a ½ inch label by 3/4 of an inch wide, so a really small label, all the way up to 4 by 6 inch labels for 55-gallon drums. Or you do produce PDF bigger ones if you needed to. But there's a lot of flexibility there, and we can always share more details about the labeling. But when it comes to ensuring compliance, one of the things we would suggest today, if it was my opportunity to sit down and talk to people, would be to look at what you're currently doing. A lot of times there's room for change. Change is scary. Nobody wants to do it, but see what you're currently doing. See if it's the best way. See if it allows you to track the new information, the new hazards, the new categories. And I don't know if you can see here, it's kind of a small screenshot, but it's just a system that allows you to go label codes, the grids, the content, the pictograms, the signal words. It's a lot of information. So if you don't have a system that allows you to put that there, it's very hard to make one up. I don't want to put that in an Excel spreadsheet columns. I don't want to copy and paste it or handwrite it into a log. Find a solution that allows you to do that. Take advantage of sources that have content. And the reason I mention that is because every call that I'm on, every potential customer I talk to, even existing customers that are looking at how do I do this, how do I come up to speed with GHS, they're looking for automatic content. Where do I get the content from? Well, unfortunately, as the different manufacturers are going out today to capture this information, there's not a ready source to do so. But Biovia has already went out and started collecting the information. So they went to your Stigmas, your Acris Organics, your Fisher Scientific. They're actually going to start collecting that content. So when we use a resource called ACD, which stands for the Available Chemicals Directory, that has over 15 million unique products in it, the goal is to help streamline the capture of that data and get it directly from the manufacturer so that from a use perspective, if I've ordered a new material, we're going to receive it in, I can source that information from ACD, hit the import button, and have it help generate a lot of this information, so it's not going to be a hugely manual process. I highlighted another thing here, too, just on the left-hand side. Again, I know it's small, but we'll be able to distribute these slides, is the ability to distinguish. As we move forward, as you're looking at your inventory and trying to understand what needs an update, have we received one from the manufacturer, how do I get one, have a way to differentiate between the OSHA format and the GHS format. So that's one of the default fields we have in the system, so that from a management perspective, if I'm one of those people trying to manage this, I can have just a simple report that tells me these are all the ones that are still in OSHA format. But I have a work list. I'm working on the things that need work, not the ones that have already been updated. In addition to that, think about how you identify the fact that you haven't got one. So if I'm working diligently through my list, looking to see if there's a new version out there, you might want to reach out and contact the manufacturer. Can I get an updated document? If they don't have one, they can't provide you one, document that. On this date, contact this manufacturer. That way you're covered. You can always go back, but just like a person that uses chemicals in a lab, there's manufacturers that use different components in their materials, and they're still waiting for the manufacturers of their components to come out with these new SDSs. There is going to be lag time. There's going to be documents that aren't readily available right by June 1st, but they're coming. So a lot of people that have to accomplish a lot of things in order to make this happen. In terms of CISPRO, it's high level. The goal is to have a building block of chemical inventory. So from a logistics standpoint, if I was to chop off all the regulatory content, we want to know barcoding. How many containers do we have? Where are they located? Who's responsible for them? When do we receive them? When do we dispose of them? When are they going to expire? Basic information. But on top of that, by integrating those two together, you can now see all the unique products we have. Whether I have one container in one lab or 100 containers across 10 different sites, I have one record. I have one SDS to maintain, but I can see how much inventory I have and where, people need to have access to that document. In addition, you can track other things. So over time, people have talked about the ability to not just track SDSs, but safety handling SOPs, disposal processes, technical data sheets, certificates of analysis, all the other things that go along with chemical inventory you can also incorporate in. And then, of course, one of the big things in addition to GHS is regulatory compliance. So being able to have the basis of what SysPro is the tracking of inventory. But on top of that, if you know what your inventory is, you can ensure compliance with OSHA and the GHS. You can also ensure that you know which materials you have are reported to different regulatory agencies like Department of Homeland Security. Here in California, we've got Prop 65, and you know where those materials are, who's being exposed to them. You've got FBI list, you've got DEA list, you've got highly hazardous materials list. All of those things can be associated, so with your inventory, you know what's reportable, and you have direct ways to know when you need to follow up with SDSs. You can document when you've contacted them, and it's all in one tidy package. It's one simple system. And, of course, if I was to sum up going to that previous slide, instead of having each person doing this, wasting time, which essentially means wasting money, if we centralize it, if we find a solution that can meet the needs of all these different things and everybody can access it, then you have one simple place to manage the safety data sheet. Everybody accesses it. It only has to be updated once, which, of course, leads to a savings of time, savings of money. And Biovia SysPro, what is it? It is a real-time chemical inventory system. We talk about chemicals first and foremost because that's why the system was designed originally over 20 years ago, but it has been expanded to include other things like biologicals, supply items, even, equipment, the pointers to tractors, seat disposals. So you have that real-time inventory. It's a user-friendly interface. It's multi-site, so you can use it, all the same materials, all the same information, create it once, shared across different regions around the world, and it even supports multi-jurisdictions. So if I'm here in the U.S., I put my GHS information in, I can manage that information. If someone in another site in another country manages the same material, but they have different GHS content, they can also just set up a different jurisdiction and have the appropriate GHS classifications there. SDS Management Association, Regulatory List Association, reports and email notifications. So it provides a lot of different features and products within the application itself. And, of course, the reason this system has been successful for so many years is because it allows for multiple different printing options. In the last year, we've adopted color printing in addition to black and white. So the majority of inventory still just requires the barcode label, the inventory label, but also adding on top of that for all of our customers to be able to ensure compliance with GHS, we now support color printing to include that red diamond around the appropriate GHS pictograms. And, of course, all of that comes down to being able to simplify, being able to use quick scanners and remote intrinsically safe scanners and even smart devices to manage that inventory, easy access, web-based, available from anywhere so that you're efficient, you can access the data that you need, and it's all done very simply. All of this really comes down to just a quick summary. What we've seen over time is that if you can integrate container inventory, so the basics of logistics, with hazard classification, then you can be in compliance. You can merge those two things together, build it once, use it many. When you then take that inventory and integrate it with SDS management, you're then meeting the second level of compliance. You have your inventory, we know how much, we know what the classifications are, the hazards. We integrate the safety data sheets so that we're simplifying, making people more efficient, and making sure they have access to that data, and we're streamlining it and automating it as much as possible. Because chemical inventory management, as I stated before, it's one of the hardest things. It's a hard sale. It's a hard thing for people to grasp that they need to do this, that they want to do this, that it'll actually, even though it seems like a change and it's going to be hard, it actually makes you more efficient. People are able to access inventory. They can access the safety information. They can print secondary labels. They can share resources. And, of course, to sum it all down, if you look forward, now's a really good time to plan. We know that changes are coming that affect not only manufacturers, but the transport of materials, the use and the disposal of chemicals. It's really a beneficial time to look at the changes that are coming and understand really how they affect your organization, because even with all the people online right now, every organization is different. how it's going to affect you is going to be different. So it's a case-by-case basis, but understanding the regulation and understanding your inventory takes you the next step farther. So look forward, look at what's coming, and look at what you could do today to make sure that you can be in compliance as the regulation changes. And of course, the baseline of all of this comes down to if you have an accurate inventory, you're able to streamline your workflows in terms of data management, get rid of dark data, put visibility, give easy access, and be very successful in the changes that come with adoption of GHS. So at this point, we went ahead and did just a quick poll. So in case we've shared information, I did see a quick question, question about slides. We will provide those slides out to you. We can also provide a recording of the presentation. We can provide you more information about how Biovia as an organization helps ensure compliance, as well as we can always demonstrate our product and how it works and how it helps streamline that adoption process. So feel free to take a minute and fill out the poll. If there's additional information, if you'd like us to contact you, we can do that. And at this time, I'd also like to open up the floor for questions. But that poll will be there. You can answer it at your leisure over the next few minutes. And at this point, I would like to open up the floor for questions.
Okay, hello, this is Ed Rakowski, Managing Editor of Periodicals at AIHA. Thanks to everyone for participating in today's rebroadcast. It looks like we have about 13 minutes or so for questions. There are a lot in the chat queue, so I'll start there and we'll get to as many as we can. And I'm just going to read these out. Ann and Denise and whoever wants to take them, just pipe right in. Here's a question from a Gary. I have heard that an employer must have SDSs, not just prior MSDSs, on file even for chemicals that were purchased prior to these requirements. Is that your understanding, even if the chemicals are now gone, or does it only apply if they're still in one's inventory?
I'll speak to that. This is Denise. There is no requirement for, first of all, there's no requirement for a manufacturer or importer to create a new safety data sheet, as Ann said during the presentation, if they no longer manufacture that chemical. So you may have products on your inventory, products in your plant that there are no new safety data sheets available for, and you need to just document the fact that you requested them and that was the response, and you would retain the old safety data sheet or MSDS that you had prior to that to provide for your hazard communication information, or as need to fulfill whatever needs you may have until that chemical is no longer at your site.
Thanks, Denise. Another question from Sandra. I have not received SDS from the manufacturer of the chemicals that my company purchases. Are they required by OSHA to send SDS to my company on June 1st, 2015?
Well, the way that the regulation is written is that a manufacturer or importer has to send you the safety data sheet with the next shipment after the safety data sheet is updated. So assuming you have have been purchasing this product all along, they're under no obligation to actually send it to you on June 1st. They're obliged to send it to you with the next shipment or prior to the next shipment. Now, the regulation does require that they provide a safety data sheet to you on request. So if you on June 2nd or June 1st want to request the safety data sheet, not wait for that next shipment, then you can certainly do that, and they would be obliged to provide that to you. I will warn everyone on the call that not every manufacturers are not going to be done on June 1st. For a lot of very complicated reasons, some that OSHA understands, and they have issued an enforcement policy that's on their website that you can look to, because they understand that having all the substances and all the mixtures and everything having to be done on the same date, that in some circumstances a manufacturer may be waiting on critical information for them to complete that safety data sheet, and it's not available. Their supplier won't have it for them maybe till May or till June 1st. In that case, they can't really produce the new safety data sheet because that key piece of information is missing. So OSHA, in their understanding of that, has decided to have an enforcement in policy that if they can document efforts, good faith efforts to do the classification on their own or to obtain the information from their supplier, and they cannot get that information until later, that there's a delay in enforcement anyway of 6 months from the time that that information is received to the completion of the new safety data sheet and label. So you might actually ask for one on June 1st, and a supplier might not be able to provide it for you.
Thanks, Denise. Another question from Sandra. Assuming that training on labels and SDS was provided by December 1st, 2013, what additional training must be provided to employees by June 1st, 2015, and how about June 1st, 2016?
Well, the regulation says that the deadline, the final deadline in the HAZCOM standard is June 1st, 2016. And by that date, employers, and this is only an employer date, have to update their signage because some of the substance-specific standards had new signage requirements that to be consistent with the GHS. So if you use a chemical covered by a substance-specific standard, you should be checking to see what those changed requirements are. And then also for any changes to your internal hazard communication program and additional training that's necessary because of new hazards that are come about because of the change in the classifications under the GHS. So that training then needs to be done at your site by June 1st, 2016. There isn't any requirement for employers to update their training by June 1st, 2015. My only suggestion to you would be to be cognizant of the fact that if some new hazard is introduced because of a classification issue that comes around because of the changes in cutoffs for mixtures and various other things that are happening with the new regulation, that you may want to go ahead and do some training for those workers before that deadline, just because, to answer their questions, make sure they understand the hazard information.
Okay. And I think this is a question for you. Will the Biovia system interface with other suppliers' LIMS?
Sure. So the Biovia program that we're talking about in this webinar is built with the architecture in place for APIs and web services to integrate with other programs like LIMS, and we do have experience integrating with other programs, so we just need to know specifically what you're looking for, the purposes, and it's definitely something we can explore and have done in the past.
Okay. Gary asks, what about inventory not being replaced? Do we have to track down the SDS for those chemicals even if we don't purchase more after June?
No, you don't need to track down the safety data sheet or the new safety data sheets for those chemicals under those conditions.
Okay. Do we still have to keep retired SDS, MSDS for materials and chemicals used for 10 years?
There was really never a 10-year requirement to retain safety data sheets. In 1910-20, which is I can't even remember the name of the standard. I'm sure that one of our, if you look in your chat box, there's a link to an OSHA interpretive letter about the role of safety data sheets or MSDSs as exposure records. Exposure records have to be retained for the duration of employment plus 30 years. And under some circumstances, an MSDS could be considered an exposure records, but there are other records that you can also maintain or retain to meet those obligations. So you probably want to take a look at that letter of interpretation.
Okay. Gregory asks, why did the compliance end date change from July 1st to June 1st?
It didn't. The original regulation was issued with the same dates that have been there since the standard was published in 2012. So I'm not quite sure. Perhaps that was just some misinformation.
Okay. And here's another one for you. How does your system handle mixtures in the lab where a label is required and bridging principles must be employed? for example, a buffer solution or HPLC mobile phase?
So the solution that we're talking about allows you to define any number of materials, whether it's commercially available, if it's a solution, something you're creating in-house. Regardless, if you define the material in the application and you set the appropriate classifications for GHS, you're able to print labels for any material that you have set up and defined.
Okay. Eugene comments, there was a mentioned need to print color labels at the site for containers. Do not see OSHA requirement to use new labels for in-plant transfer containers, just a hazard warning with name. I'm not sure if either of you want to comment on that.
Well, I'll comment first, and then maybe if, we can see if there's other comments that come up. But OSHA, yes, you are correct that OSHA, the standard allows a lot of flexibility for your in-plant labeling or secondary container labeling. And in those circumstances, you can use the GHS pictograms with black borders rather than red. You can continue to use alternative labeling systems like HMIS or NFPA. You can have a different labeling system that you've developed all yourself. So any of those things are allowed. Remember, the language in the standard says that you can have the product identifier, and that's always key. You must have the product identifier that then you could link back to the safety data sheet, and any combinations of words, pictures, whatever that communicate the hazards and that workers are trained to understand. So I would agree, though that's not to say that I don't think color labels are great, because I do think they're eye-catching. I think they communicate very well. It reminds people of the hazard. So I think the color is great. I don't mean to make it sound like I'm not a big proponent of it, because I am. But I do recognize that the regulation does not require that.
Okay, thanks, Denise. Here's a question from Melissa. I have had many clients complain about the requirement about training so far in advance of program implementation, such as new SDSs. Is there a logical answer I can provide on reasoning?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because OSHA actually addressed that in their preamble to the standard when it was published back in 2012. Which seems so short a time ago. And the reason they wanted to have people do the training early is because they really felt that the process of getting safety data sheets and new labels in the workplace was going to take place much faster than it has. So they were concerned that workers would see a lot of these labels and they wouldn't understand them, and they wanted to make sure that that wouldn't occur. As it's turned out, that process has taken a lot longer than OSHA anticipated, and that a lot of people have anticipated. And so I think, now it might be wise to retrain your workers, because I think that we're going to see a very compressed period for all of that information to come flying in at the same time.
Okay, and we are right up against the 2 o'clock end time. I'm going to try and sneak one more question in here. There's a question from David. Is it possible that current materials classified as combustible may now be classified as flammable in the new GHS system? If yes, how will GHS view material storage in these situations?
Well, I'll just take a real quick answer to that, and that is that the GHS, of course, doesn't have anything to do with flammable liquid storage, but OSHA did change the flammable and combustible liquid standard to address these issues, and they put in hard flashpoint stops for the various storage situations, so that they're consistent with what you've done in the past and with the NFPA classification system for flammable and combustible liquids. So if you go back to that updated version of those standards, you'll see where those changes are in there to accommodate the change in classification to a flammable liquid, but retaining the pre-existing storage requirements.
Okay, and unfortunately we're out of time. My thanks to Ann Sefried and Denese Deeds for serving on the panel today, to Biovia for sponsoring this webinar, and to all of our listeners for tuning in today. Please be on the lookout for notices about other upcoming Synergist webinars, and have a good day.